Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard Podcast, your twice weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who is steadily becoming a highly trained broadcast specialist, and I am blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And today, I am on the road. I'm not behind the Brunswick Green PLB microphone, but I am here in Grapevine, Texas. And behind me, for those of you on CP5 Cam, you see the Grapevine Vintage Railroad. So the Grapevine Vintage Railroad is out here actually on the same tracks as the Fort Worth and Western, and portions of its right-of-way are shared with Trinity Railway Express and TexRail. So there's a lot of really neat rail history and rail operations out here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, and so I wanted to come by, give you a great background as we talk about Amtrak. Now, I originally came down here because I wanted to go to a station where Amtrak had been serving for a while and no longer is operating, but due to traffic and all the other things that go along with being in the Metroplex, we're out here. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the history because we spent so much time discussing passenger rail in the context of Randall O'Toole's book about why passenger trains, why the trains we have are not really the trains that we need. So let's get into a little bit of the history of Amtrak and how it came about and the role it's playing today. The prelude to Amtrak really came about, believe it or not, in the 1920s. So if you think about it then, that was the time when railroads reached their peak in terms of passenger rail miles. And miles are really the best way, passenger miles are the best way that we can talk about how effective a mode of transportation is. And that's because you've got to remember that if we have a population of about 100 people and 100 people go to work, or let's say 60 of those people go to work, you're going to have the same person who's traveling back and forth in a variety of situations. So rather than talking about the raw number of riders, we're talking about the miles that they travel. So that's why we talk about passenger miles. And the railroads, American passenger railroads, experienced their peak in the 1920s. And it's notable, at that point, it declined, and it declined pretty substantially. And it did not see a peak again until 1942, when 1944, when 92.68 billion passenger miles were traveled by people on America's passenger railroads. The rail had been in decline before that, and it promptly went back into decline after that. Now, a lot of the reason those passenger miles were being traveled was, of course, because of the military mobilization. And you had so many of our great soldiers, the greatest generation, World War II vets, who were traveling, whether it was to go to the theater, to go to training, or to go back home to their families, use passenger rail, and that was amazing. Now, I have my own theory, which I've outlined in some other episodes, where I talked about how I believe that this experience, while it was a great mobilization and it showed how well the private railroads were organized and how well they could do to help support our national defense needs, that this also had a perverse impact in actually making a lot of people, a whole generation, less interested in traveling on passenger rail. And that's because you've got to remember the conditions under which they traveled. First of all, they were traveling to war. Anytime that you're associating something with such a negative activity as war, going to fight in very difficult areas, seeing their friends, their brothers, being killed, you name it, there's a negative connotation that's going to be associated with passenger rail as a result. But also, let's remember, take the troop sleeper, for example. One of the things that was consistently discussed about the troop sleepers and the troop trains is that they were relatively uncomfortable. Now, were they far more comfortable than traveling out in open Jeeps and so forth within the military theater? Absolutely. But when you consider the Allied full cushion trucks, for example, which were used under a lot of the troop sleepers and the troop diners and so forth that were out there, were very uncomfortable. When you consider that people were in bunk beds, not comfortable Pullman sleeping cabins all the time, but a lot of bunk beds and so on, that was very uncomfortable. So I do believe that you had a lot of people who were part of this 92.68 billion passenger miles, who were our troops, great people who served our country. Once they saw that they had an opportunity to do something else, travel in a way that was not evocative of those negative feelings, I do believe they decided to move along and do something else. And that, of course, meant the automobile. It also meant air transportation as the post-World War II era wore on. Now, the railroads were certainly mindful that they had a lot of people who were utilizing their equipment and paying fares, and they wanted to hold on to this. And this is why you remember so much of the time period that I love to talk about on this podcast. And that, of course, is the post-war era. Now, some of this started before the war with the late 1930s, the introduction of the Silver Meteor by the Seaboard Airline, built by the Edward G. Budd Manufacturing Company, the early Southerner and so forth, these short streamlined trains, the Pioneer Zephyr before all of those. Then after World War II, we started to see the Alco PA. We started to see more EMDE units. We saw the Erie builds that were built by Fairbanks Morse. We saw the Baldwin six-axle Sharks, the A1A truck. We saw the Budd cars, passenger sleepers, coaches, baggage cars, diners, you name it. You saw ACF, Pullman Standard, all of these dressed in beautiful schemes such as that right behind me. All of those truly did revolutionize the way rail passenger transportation was provided in the United States, and it made for a dramatic break with the trains that people had been riding during World War II and previously. But unfortunately, after that 1944 period, the rail passenger miles were in decline, and these new trains were simply not being used anywhere near to a level that justified what would be now billions of dollars of expenditures in going into that new equipment, but also the enthusiasm of the folks who were operating the railroad. As we talked about the emotional aspect of going to war for our soldiers, let's also talk about the emotional aspect of leading a business where the operations are not going quite as well and the returns are not going quite as well as you expect them to be. Keep in mind, and you can do this, go over to streamlinermemories.info or just do a Google search of anything from the 1940s or 1950s. What you see is tons of enthusiasm. Think about Robert R. Young and all of the innovation that went into creating the chassis, as we discussed a couple of episodes ago. Think about the New York Central, who re-equipped the 20th Century Limited in 1948. Think about the Great Northern, who, by the way, in both 1947 and 1951, put whole sets of new equipment, brand new streamline equipment on their Empire Builder between Chicago, Seattle, and Portland, Oregon. And by the way, this wasn't just simply two train sets. In the case of the 1951 re-equipping of the Great Northern Empire Builder, that was 6 brand new 15-car consists that had to be prepared for that train. Because remember, it takes several days to get between Chicago and Seattle, and if I recall correctly, it is 3 days. Therefore, on each day, you have a train consist departing each endpoint. So one from Chicago, one from Seattle, and a section going out from Portland as well. So all of those there had to be enough sets to support that, not to mention having spare cars. Now, it wasn't that the GN purchased these cars in 51 and threw the 47 cars away. They actually took the 47 cars and created the Western Star, which was the second train that was operating along that route. There were other trains that operated in general where this was needed. Cars were also needed for pool service. So it wasn't a question of just simply old cars, which in that case would only be 4 years old, going away. They were, other uses were found for them, and this was certainly a positive thing. But that shows you the enthusiasm that was there. But then think about the other side of it. What happens when now that enthusiasm is met by absolute crickets or relative crickets from the passenger community? And they're saying, look, the trains are nice, we just don't want to ride them. So that is one of the things that really did make rail managers much, much less enthusiastic about passenger rail in any form, whether it be provided by them on their own account or later on by Amtrak, and most certainly a lot of the tourists and excursion folks that wanted to come along and use the rails later. Now, of course, there are other factors that go into that, such as liability and such as freight train interference, which became a bigger issue once railroads were no longer the primary operators of these passenger trains, and they could look out and say, well, that's somebody else's train. Why do I care about what it's doing on why do I want it on my track? Why do I care about what it's doing? But that's another thing that you've got to factor into, which ultimately led to the creation of Amtrak. And one more thing I'd like to point out, and we'll discuss in an upcoming episode where we talk about cruise trains, the 1949 California Zephyr, the Silver Lady, which was, before its time, the same sort of thing that you see nowadays with the Rocky Mountaineer. And also the now departed, sadly, American Orient Express. These were trains that were optimized for the tourist. Even though they did provide a common carrier function, they were optimized for the tourist with dome cars, with very extravagant dining facilities, and certainly the top of the line that could be found anywhere outside of a private car for sleeping quarters. And that's why these trains were there, and that's what the railroads put into them. So, as you get into the late 1950s, you start to see discontinuances. One of the things that really threw me was when I read the book From Zephyr to Amtrak, and we'll put a link to that in the description. You could see how early some of these streamlined trains started to be downgraded or simply discontinued. One of them that were always stuck with me was the Dixie Flagler. Now, the Dixie Flagler operated tri-weekly between Chicago and Miami. It operated on the Chicago and Eastern Illinois, Louisville and Nashville, Central of Georgia, Atlantic coastline, and Florida East Coast. And it was originally ICCOG, LNN, yeah, yep, okay. The number of railroads that it operates over, sometimes I make sure I don't miss it. But the Chicago and Eastern Illinois, Louisville and Nashville, Central of Georgia, Atlantic coastline, and Florida East Coast to get between Chicago and Miami. This was technically the Florida East Coast train because it had originally been the Henry M. Flagler, that original consist, 7 cars that operated with an E3 between Jacksonville and Miami. This train was renamed the Dixieland, and then eventually it was broken up. And when I say broken up, I mean, it was no longer operated as a through train as early as the late 1950s. So that shows you where this decay was starting to happen. And keep in mind, it was serving the Southeast, which was a growing region, but it was not growing with passenger rail, at least not in the way that passenger rail had been done up to that point. Now, other trains that operate on that route, the South Wind and also the City of Miami continue to operate in a fairly strong fashion, particularly the City of Miami, which was always believed to be the Chicago to Florida Streamliner that Amtrak would take over, which of course it did not do. But that gives you an idea of where things were going. The Missouri, Kansas, Texas, they got out of their passenger business to the greatest extent that they could. The Frisco, they downgraded their passenger business to the greatest extent that they could. The smaller operators started to get out, and then this started to be seen in the larger operations, whether we're talking about combining trains, and the most notable there was Union Pacific, combining the city of San Francisco with the city of Los Angeles, the city of Denver, and the city of Portland, which was jokingly referred to as the city of everywhere because it was one consist that would depart Chicago Union Station on the Milwaukee Road behind a bevy of E units, and it could be anywhere as many as 5 to 6 at the front, and you had all of the equipment in one train that would have one portion that would eventually branch off to Denver, and then the rest of the train would continue through Cheyenne and then out to Ogden, Utah, where a section, the city of Los Angeles, would go down to Los Angeles. Another portion would go over the Southern Pacific to Oakland, and then of course the final portion going up to Portland, Oregon on the Union Pacific via Pocatello and Boise. This is an example of the efforts that the railroads would go through to try to make the best of a situation that was declining. And I think one thing that is very interesting that will be worth looking up is the efforts of Paul Rystrup as in his role with the Chesapeake in Ohio and Baltimore in Ohio. He was a Baltimore and Ohio employee, but working with the C&O and B&O's passenger service, as both carriers were under common control by that point, to try to implement new things, whether it was movies on board and special fares to the extent that they were able to do that under ICC regulation in order to reduce the losses and try to drag people back to the train. So, in 1967, you have a man named Tony Haswell, who's still alive, founded the National Association of Railroad Passengers, and that remains the leading railroad passenger advocacy group, and they're always on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., doing whatever they can to help persuade members of Congress, and then, of course, to a certain extent, the executive branch as well, that passenger rail is worth having. Tony Haswell would be one of the people who was behind the creation of the Rail Passenger Service Act of 1970, which is Public Law 91-518, and it was passed on October 30th of 1970 by a voice vote. The RPSA is what is the enabling legislation for what we now call the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, or Amtrak. Now, this was after a lot of consideration of alternatives. Throughout the 1960s, there had been extensive discussion of the railroad problem overall. This is not just passenger, but it's also freight. It's where the genesis of the railroad deregulation, the economic deregulation, I should say, that wouldn't come about until 1980 really began. But this is when a lot of policymakers in Washington, D.C. started to recognize that no, railroads were not some evil enterprise to be demonized in newspaper cartoons, that they were not monopolists. Commodore Vanderbilt was not walking through that door. Jay Gould and Jim Fisk were not walking through that door, and the people who were running these companies were not some plutocrats to be demagogue, but they were actually providing valuable public services, and they were struggling under the weight of regulation at the federal and state level in order to accomplish that. And they also recognized, as a result of a lot of these conversations, that there is a very real possibility that not only could the passenger trains go away, but all of the trains could go away. So this was very much in the ethos of the time. And then one more thing, during the summer preceding the passage of the Rail Passenger Service Act, the Penn Central, the Pennsylvania New York Central Transportation Company, at that time went bankrupt in the biggest bankruptcy in American history until Enron would go bankrupt in the early 2000s. So that gives you an idea of how important a role that railroads were playing even amid their decline in both passenger and freight in the 1960s, that an enterprise as big as Penn Central number one could be formed out of different railroads. But then its bankruptcy was so noteworthy that it not only just made a few headlines, it very much preoccupied both Wall Street and policymakers. So against this backdrop is when the legislation for the RPSA for Amtrak was passed, and then on May 1st, 1971, Amtrak starts its operations. And this was a very jarring event for anybody who was associated with passenger rail and rail transportation as a whole. First of all, it was a seismic shift, because now we were no longer talking about a large number of companies with different procedures, different approaches, and different ideas providing services to different people. The days of regionally focused rail transportation were over. We now had a monolithic federal bureaucracy that was responsible for these trains. Now, they were not providing the services strictly themselves, because at this point, Amtrak did not have any equipment, it didn't have any operating crews, and it didn't own any track. So by most calculations, it wasn't actually a railroad, but it was funding the operation of a skeleton number of trains. Now, if you go back and you look at some early Amtrak maps, the ones that were issued before Amtrak Day or A-Day on May 1st, 1971, you'll see that they had originally planned to operate between Chicago and Oakland, not on the city of San Francisco route, but to operate through Denver on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, which by then was the Burlington Northern, the old Denver Zephyr route into Denver, and then follow the California Zephyrs route, which same as the Denver Zephyr into Denver, follow the California Zephyr route over the Rio Grande up to Salt Lake City and Ogden, and then turn left or turn west and head on the Southern Pacific to Oakland. But the Rio Grande threw a monkey wrench in that, and they said, we're not joining Amtrak. And they, of course, continued to operate the Rio Grande Zephyr until 1983, it being the last privately operated intercity common carrier passenger train, even to this date. Now, there was one that did operate on Texas Mexican in the 1980s, and I believe into the 1990s. It may very well have been pulled by a GP60, which for most of you may not be a big deal, but I think it's just noteworthy that a locomotive like that may very well have regularly pulled an intercity passenger train, even if it was a mixed train. But this was the last that was not a mixed train. Certainly, the Seaboard system continued to operate the Georgia Railroad's mixed train until 1984, so outlasting the Rio Grande Zephyr by just a little bit there. Another railroad that was projected to join Amtrak and was actually listed on those original maps was the Southern Railway. And it's famous by then Southern Crescent between New York and New Orleans through Washington, D.C., Charlottesville, Atlanta, Birmingham, Meridian, Mississippi, and then, of course, on to New Orleans. Please go to our YouTube channel, which is All Things Trains USA, and take a look at some of my videos taken from the Crescent, because we did ride that route and talk a little bit about that train's history there. But it was projected to join, but Graham Claytor, who was running the Southern Railway at the time, decided not to join Amtrak. Now, he pulled a little sleight of hand, though. While the Southern Railway itself did not join, its subsidiary railroad, the Central of Georgia, who had its own passenger services, most notably between Savannah and Atlanta, did join. And this was the result, or the subject of a lawsuit later on, because there were some passenger advocates that said, hey, wait a second, if the Southern's not joining, why is the Central of Georgia joining, and then those trains being discontinued? We want those trains to continue to run. But the courts ultimately did hold that the Southern could, in fact, decide not to join and continue to operate the Southern Crescent, along with several other trains, including the Piedmont and Carolina Special, whereas the Central of Georgia, despite its being a wholly owned subsidiary of the Southern, could in fact join and discontinue all of its services, because not only would it then be freed from the obligation of operating the trains, but also Amtrak didn't pick them up, because it was up to Amtrak to decide what it wanted to run and where it was going to do so. And that is really how we got that original basic network. A couple of interesting things about that. Amtrak was originally designed, as remains today, a private corporation. It was a private corporation that is funded and subsidized by the U.S. government, but a private corporation nonetheless. Again, this is part of the ethos of the time. If Amtrak were created today, I don't think any of the politicians, whether they be Republican or Democrat, would have a problem with just creating a public agency and saying that's it. But at the time, even though President Nixon was by no means the most free marketer that you would ever meet, he very much did not like the idea of creating a government bureaucracy in the traditional, or in the sense of, let's say, the Social Security Administration, or what would later become Medicare and Medicaid and so on. So this was created as a private company, and it was designed to either A, collapse, which many people did in fact expect it to do, or B, to thrive and stay private. But, of course, the federal government had to have a role, because the idea was for the federal government to support the operations of these trains. And so, since that time, Amtrak has continued to issue preferred stock, and the preferred stock, or I should say convertible preferred stock, is the stock that has the control over the corporation. Issue that stock to the DOT in exchange for the subsidy that it receives from the DOT, or I should say from we, the taxpayer, through Congress and through the DOT. But the DOT is the holder of that. The common stock, though, was issued to a number of railroads that chose to accept it. Now, not every railroad had to accept it, but what every railroad who joined Amtrak did have to do is pay an amount that was equal to some level of their loss for some of the recent years preceding 1971. So that was to help initially capitalize Amtrak. Furthermore, but they could take the stock if they wanted to, or they could simply just say, hey, that was an expense, write it down. Some railroads did. Penn Central was one that did. The Grand Trunk was another. The Milwaukee Road was a third. But this stock was not widely desired, and that's partly because the railroads were saying, well, these trains have been losers for us. They're probably going to be losers for you too. We're not really going to get very much out of it. Now, why does this common stock matter? Well, a couple of decades later, Carl Lindner's organization, which is American Financial Group, and Carl Lindner, who for a period of time until his death was the owner of the Cincinnati Reds, succeeding Marge Schott, he and American Financial Group believed that this stock was worth something, so they did in fact attempt to sell the stock back to Amtrak for a significant amount of money, which was declined by Amtrak, who said that it was really only worth about $1 per share, which was a dramatic difference in the millions of dollars per share, or excuse me, millions of dollars total that American Financial Group was looking for. And so as far as I know, they still do have their stake. Now you're wondering, how did Carl Lindner, who owned an insurance company and controlled a baseball team, end up being in charge of a big block of Amtrak common stock? Well, that goes to the Penn Central. The Penn Central, of course, went bankrupt in 1976. The majority of its rail operations were divested to Conrail. Some were completely shut down, of course. Majority went to Conrail. The Penn Central, I believe it was Penn Central Company, was the final enterprise that came out of the reorganization. And its largest shareholder was then as now the estate of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, which in itself is its own interesting ball of wax. It had Amtrak securities, and it kept those securities. And Penn Central became a conglomerate. Eventually, it did sell off a lot of the assets that it had purchased subsequently, along with some of the ones that it kept from the pre-bankruptcy times, and these were assets such as Buckeye Pipeline and other non-railroad activities. I believe Six Flags, one of the predecessor companies for Six Flags, was actually part of that as well. Arvida, the property developer in the state of Florida. Well, a lot of those were sold off, but some of it did remain, including its primary shareholder, or largest shareholder, the New Haven estate, ultimately came in under the control of the American Financial Group. The Penn Central, which is the original incorporated Pennsylvania Railroad from April 13th, 1846, continues to exist within that corporate structure. It is technically an auto insurer, which means it is now back in the transportation business, if in another way, but it also does in fact control a large block of Amtrak stock, which gives it no ability to have any say-so in how Amtrak is run, but it does give them an equity ownership stake in America's passenger rail system. And also, there are two Canadian railroads, Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Kansas City, that also have an ownership stake in America's railroads. That's because, of course, the Milwaukee Road stake, although not the Milwaukee Road, the corporation itself, but its stake in Amtrak did end up passing to Canadian Pacific through the Soo Line, which is one of CP's U.S. subsidiaries, while the Grand Trunk, which continues as a subsidiary of the Canadian National, which it has been for generations, ever since it was reorganized, and Canadian Government Railways and Canadian National were all combined into Canadian Northern were all reorganized to create the Canadian National. They have controlled the Grand Trunk as part of that reorganization from the early 1900s, and it, of course, had Amtrak securities. Now, I am not clear as of 2024 if either of those carriers still have the securities or if they did end up selling them back to Amtrak, because his name, Alex Kumont, when Alex Kumont was president of Amtrak, he and his administration did attempt to get back as many of those common shares as possible, in part because that would end a lot of the challenges that they were facing from dissident, non-controlling common shareholders. So I can't be sure if they did, but they did for a time have a substantial stake in Amtrak's ownership. Now, what is Amtrak today? Well, it is the primary intercity passenger rail operator in the United States, and it has its long distance trains, and that includes the Empire Builder that we were talking about earlier, which dates back to the 1800s with the Great Northern. It operates the California Zephyr, which was, of course, the combination of the Denver Zephyr, which was assumed by Amtrak, and the city of San Francisco of Union Pacific, that was assumed by Amtrak. It operates the Sunset Limited, which has continued to operate again since the 1800s between Los Angeles and New Orleans. For a time, it did go to San Francisco, or I should say at times in its life. Another interesting train, the City of New Orleans, which was the City of New Orleans. It was profiled, or I should say memorialized by Arlo Guthrie in the famous song. It continues to operate on a daily basis between Chicago and New Orleans. Extensive network in the east, the Lakeshore Limited, the Silver Star, the Silver Meteor, the Pennsylvanian, the Crescent, all of these trains that they operate. And then, of course, they have a extensive business in providing regional trains under contract with states such as California, Virginia, New York, Illinois, Michigan, and Indiana, or not any Indiana anymore, but for quite some time with Indiana, which was, of course, the Hoosier State, and for a while the Kentucky Cardinal there. And also Washington State, and I'm sorry I left out Washington State and Oregon there as well. So those are extensive businesses. And then, of course, let's not forget what they would consider to be their crown jewel, which is the Northeast Corridor line, which they own between the Massachusetts state line and New Haven, Connecticut, and then also between let me make sure I get this right here, New Rochelle, New York, and Washington, D.C. Now, they don't own all the Northeast Corridor. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts owns the portion that is within Massachusetts, and it's operated and maintained by Amtrak under agreement with them, which actually predates Amtrak and goes back to the New Haven during its bankruptcy, the New York, New Haven, and Hartford. And they do not own the portion between New Rochelle and New Haven, which was sold to the Connecticut DOT by Penn Central during its bankruptcy, or I should say it was leased by Penn Central to the Connecticut DOT and later on sold to them by Penn Central. I believe that took place actually in the late 1990s, which made for a very interesting time, believe it or not, until relatively recently. Not only did Penn Central continue to own that route, but one of their subsidiaries, one that you might be familiar with, the Hudson River Railroad, in fact continued to own some former New York Central routes, including what is now Metro North Hudson Line, which plays host to Amtrak's Empire Service and Lakeshore Limited trains. It continued to own it until the mid-2000s, I believe 2006. So if you thought it was, if you took a ride during that time, you were in fact riding over a line that was owned by the Commodore Vanderbilt himself. And that was just one of the odd knots of rail history that a lot of people forgot, but is certainly happy to talk about here. So I hope you had a good glimpse into what Amtrak is today, how Amtrak came about, and some of the more interesting things about its existence. Now, as you know, I am not a big Amtrak fan. I'm a free market guy. If passenger trains are going to be run, and I love passenger trains, I want to be run by the private sector because, quite frankly, I'll ride Amtrak's trains, but I don't think they anywhere near come to the level of what most people expect from an intercity passenger train. Most of what we believe, largely because of the media, is something close to what is provided by the Rocky Mountaineer or even the Venice Simplon Orient Express, some of the trains that are operated out in Europe, and certainly Via Rail's Canadian in Canada. Now, I understand there's a lot of questions about the economics of some of these trains. Can they be made profitable? I certainly do believe they can, and I don't mean this to knock Amtrak employees or Amtrak leadership, some of whom I've gotten to know over the years, but what I do encourage you to do is go out and ride as many of the trains as you can, because as we've seen with Via Rail Canada, we don't know how long they're going to be around. We do not have a right to passenger rail service, so these trains could go away, and COVID-19 very well could have resulted in the end of some of those long distance trains. The current Amtrak leadership actually proposed to split the Southwest Chief, which is one of the most storied trains because that does in fact go back to the actual super chief of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe and the El Capitan. They proposed to actually truncate it in the middle and have a bus bridge operating between the two ends. The only thing I can think of that would be worse than a train that doesn't live up to what people want from it is a train that they have to get off of one train, ride a bus, and then get on the same train somewhere else. So please ride the trains, document the trains, enjoy them, because their existence is something that is quintessentially American and is something that is truly special and quite frankly does not exist in any other part of the world. There are trains in Europe and what I'm told, they're really good, and the same goes for Japan and so on, but the fact that we still have a classic American passenger rail network that truly does exemplify the way we here in America did trains, even if it's a shell of its former self, is something that you should enjoy. And I'm going to keep doing it and sharing videos of that with you here too. So we will be back. We will be back on Wednesday with the next episode. And I'm not quite sure what we're going to talk about, but I want you to be there to hear it. You'll enjoy it. We will see you down the main line. And I'm going to take my camera, which I got right here, and go out and do some shooting before I call it a day. So thanks again, and I hope you have a great one.